She thought tourists could get away with anything, even mocking a royal guard. But one unexpected gesture changed everything. What happened next became a lesson in respect for everyone. Let's start from the very beginning. London was sweltering in the summer heat, but that didn't stop the throngs of tourists from storming Buckingham Palace. They all came equipped with the standard kit: a camera, a water bottle, and zero understanding of what respect meant. In front of the grand gates stood Guard James Winters, as motionless as a statue and as proud as the spirit of Britain itself. The bearskin hat on his head, the red tunic, every part of his uniform screamed, "I'm not here for your silly entertainment!" But was anyone listening? Amid the crowd stood Kate, a girl who seemed to overflow with recklessness. Her hair was perfectly curled, her laugh was bright and annoyingly confident. Her friends, self-proclaimed experts in British customs, giggled and nudged her forward as if they were on a low-budget reality show. "Go on, tell him," one of her friends practically squealed with excitement. "Maybe it's love at first sight." Yeah, right. A guard whose day consisted of hours of standing still and listening to nonsense was totally waiting for a tourist to flip into romance mode. James's eyes stayed fixed on a single point, as if trying to ignore the circus his post was turning into. Kate, pushing past either embarrassment or the last shred of common sense, stepped forward. She stopped at the white line separating respect from audacity. The moment her sneakers hit the pavement dangerously close to that boundary, James tensed internally. But his face showed not the slightest hint of emotion, just flawless composure. I want to confess my love to you," Kate shouted, her cheeks flushing, her voice trembling with excitement. The crowd froze. Even the pigeons, usually darting around the square like little beggars, paused mid-peck. And then, a chuckle rang out. That contemptuous, hesitant laugh people make when someone does something outrageously foolish, and no one's sure whether to laugh or cry. Seriously? This is what modern society has come to? Confessing love to a guard who, by the way, is on duty? Who does that? Smartphones shot into the air, as if this were a scene from a budget reality show. Faces glowed with anticipation. After all, what could be better than another TikTok video of someone trying to elicit a reaction from a royal guard? Never mind that it looked as ridiculous as trying to wake up an ancient Roman statue. Somewhere in the background, a disgruntled whisper could be heard. "This should be banned. They're not clowns at a fair." James remained motionless. Inside, he was ready to put all these tourists in their place, but externally, perfect discipline. He knew his duty was to uphold honor and tradition, even when someone turned it into a cheap spectacle. Kate waited for a reaction. Her eyes glimmered with hope, that naive hope that her gesture might change centuries-old tradition. But nothing happened. No smile, no sigh, not even the faintest movement. Just a majestic silence and a stern gaze fixed into infinity. And that's when the crowd's sarcasm began to grow. "It's his job, not a romantic drama." Isn't she embarrassed? Of course not. She was a tourist. She paid for her tickets, so she thought she could do whatever she wanted. Or, could she? Kate took a step back, her confidence beginning to fade. She turned to her friends, but their laughter now felt distant. The crowd was already losing interest. People were retreating back into their cameras and attempts to snap selfies in front of those who stood guard over tradition. But there was an unmistakable sense of dissatisfaction and a faint hint of shame in the air. Shame that in a world obsessed with instant content, respect for tradition had become just a hashtag, not a real principle of life. The crowd at Buckingham Palace buzzed like an anthill that had just been prodded with a stick. After her confession of love, Kate didn't get the reaction she was hoping for. No smile, no grateful nod, not even the slightest hint that Guard James Winters took it personally. He stood there as a royal guard should, unflinching, dignified, and oh yes, completely impervious to cheap tricks. But for Kate, the show wasn't over. After all, she was a tourist, and in her mind, that meant one thing. "I'm in charge here. I paid for this, so I deserve entertainment." She stepped forward and began waving her hands right in front of James's face, as if trying to swat away an annoying fly. "Come on, smile! What are you, a robot?" she said, her voice trembling with irritation, her face showing the pouty defiance of a child. Seriously? She thinks centuries of royal honor and discipline will crumble because of her ridiculous antics? Of course, because this is exactly what we've all been waiting for. The crowd chuckled, but not as confidently now. Some people began whispering, their faces showing confusion and mild indignation. Is respect out of fashion these days? Muttered an elderly man with a cane, shaking his head. This is shameful. This kind of thing should be stopped. It's not a circus, added a middle-aged woman, recording the scene on her phone. But Kate seemed to exist in her own world, where crowd attention and likes were more important than common sense. Her friends, meanwhile, were practically choking with laughter. Go on, Kate! Maybe he'll even ask you out! One of them shouted, prompting a murmur of disapproval from the crowd. James didn't move. His gaze remained fixed forward, as though there wasn't a hysterical tourist before him, just empty space. But inside, he felt his patience stretching taut, like a drawn bowstring. Hold it together. This is part of the job. You didn't endure months of training to lose your composure over this clownery. My breaking point. Suddenly, Kate decided to take things up a notch. She stretched out her hand and pretended she was going to touch his bearskin hat. Is it real? Or are you a fake too? She said with a smirk. The moment hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. A few people in the crowd gasped, another second, and that thin layer of patience could shatter. Hey, don't do that, someone called from the back. He's not a toy, he's a soldier on duty. But Kate, seemingly deaf to reason, brought her fingers even closer to the hat. She was on the brink, and the scene had become a tug-of-war between dignity and audacity. Who does that? Touching a guard? This isn't just silly. It's offensive, the crowd reacts. Then something happened that Kate clearly didn't expect. The crowd turned against her. Stop it! Shouted the woman filming. You're embarrassing the whole country! Leave if you can't behave, added a man wearing a shirt with the British flag, his voice full of anger. Her friends weren't laughing anymore. They sensed the shift in mood and started glancing around nervously, avoiding eye contact with the furious crowd. Even the pigeons seemed to scatter, unwilling to be associated with this spectacle. And James? James stood his ground, a symbol of everything that once defined respect and honor, emotions behind the scenes. She thought she could buy attention, buy a smile, buy a show. But some things aren't for sale. Dignity is one of them. The crowd now looked at Kate like a clown who had overstayed her welcome. Smartphones were still pointed at the scene, but now it wasn't for a fun TikTok video. It was a lesson about what happens when you cross the line. Kate took a step back, her face flushing not from excitement, but from shame. Tension hung in the air, and it felt as if even the palace walls were glaring at her in reproach. But the conflict was only heating up. The crowd was starting to tire of the pointless spectacle. Kate's giggles and those of her friends grew quieter, and even the most devoted fans of scandalous content began to think, all right, the show's over, let's get to Tower Bridge. The air was thick with irritation, mixed with a lingering sense of shame no one wanted to admit. But just at that moment, when it seemed like foolishness had triumphed over common sense, a small boy cautiously stepped toward James. His blonde hair shimmered like a halo in the sunlight, and in his hands he held a modest bouquet of wildflowers, bright but slightly crushed. His mother clutched her purse nervously, ready to intervene and pull her child back at any moment. The boy gazed at the guard with pure admiration, seeking no reward. He wasn't recording a TikTok, wasn't giggling, and wasn't searching for cheap thrills. In his eyes, the guard was a hero, a defender of old traditions and a symbol of honor that the adults around him were so desperately trying to trample. The boy took one last step forward and, raising his hand, offered the flowers to the guard. He looked up and smiled, so sincerely that even the most cynical onlookers might have shed a tear. Someone in the crowd gasped, cameras lowered, and a whisper swept through the ranks. Now that's real respect. Despite the strictness of protocol, James allowed himself the faintest movement. He slowly inclined his head and softly said, Thank you, young sir. And yes, maybe the world didn't collapse from that barely perceptible nod, but the crowd was definitely still. The laughter faded into silence, and the air filled with something warm, almost forgotten. Respect. Seriously? One small gesture, and everything suddenly makes sense? Yes, exactly. That's what happens when genuine humanity breaks through a world full of cheap bravado and meaningless antics. Kate stood there, stunned by the scene. Her earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist. She looked at the guard and the boy, and her heart tightened uncomfortably. For the first time all day, she saw James not as a prop for her performance, but as a person. A man with duty, discipline, and a heart. Her face paled, and her eyes filled with an understanding that had come too late. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely believing she'd said it aloud. James didn't respond. He didn't need to. His duty was to stand guard, not to give moral lessons. But the subtle, almost imperceptible nod spoke louder than any words. It was a sign of forgiveness, but also a reminder. Respect isn't optional. It's essential. The crowd's reaction. The crowd came back to life. Someone whispered, "There's the difference between true respect and cheap antics." Some looked at Kate with clear disapproval. An elderly man in a sharp suit couldn't resist saying loudly, "Maybe now you'll understand that honor isn't for sale for likes." Kate's friends looked away, their giggles replaced by awkward silence. In that moment, it was clear. The guard wasn't the joke. They were. The moral blow. Kate lowered her head and took a step back. Now she just wanted to disappear into the crowd, to merge with the anonymous tourists who weren't trying to be stars of their own show. But her mistake was already captured on video, and the comments were inevitable. Tourists like that should just be kicked out. Respect other people's traditions. That little boy showed what real honor is. Maybe the adults should try it too. The unexpected turn. Sometimes, all it takes to reveal a human heart is a small gesture. The irony was that it took a silent guard and a shy boy to restore meaning to this absurd spectacle. And Kate? Her confession became an empty sound against the power of that silence. Now she knew. Sometimes it's better to be quiet and learn respect than to demand a show without understanding that true dignity is not a performance. It's uncompromising honor. The crowd quieted after the guard's unexpected gesture, then erupted into applause. A wave of approval swept across the square in front of Buckingham Palace, like a cleansing breeze clearing dust from ancient statues. "That's right! Respect above all!" someone shouted from the back, and those words, like thunder in a clear sky, sobered everyone around. Now, Kate's friends' giggling didn't sound funny. It sounded pitiful and awkward. Their smug smiles had been replaced with sour expressions. One of them tried to smile, but it came out crooked and out of place. The irony was clear. A minute ago, they thought they were the stars of the day. Now, they were just extras in a play where honor, resilience, and composure played the leading roles. Seriously, do you see this too? These tourists who were making faces a minute ago now look like they just stepped in a puddle of their own foolishness. And it's not even funny. It's just sad. A tall man with a sarcastic edge to his voice said, "Lesson learned, huh?" Kate's face turned the color of a setting sun. She couldn't hide behind her friends or her designer handbag. She was in full view, a glaring example of how a quest for entertainment turned into a public lesson. She took a deep breath, feeling each heartbeat thud in her ears. Then, gathering the last shreds of her dignity, she approached the white line, the boundary between empty bravado and genuine respect. "Thank you for your patience and service," she said, her voice trembling but sincere. James's reaction. Silence full of meaning. James didn't respond, and rightly so. Sometimes words aren't necessary. His straight posture, perfect stance, and cold gaze forward spoke louder than any reply. He wasn't just a guard on duty. He was a symbol of resilience, a man who maintained composure even when the world around him descended into chaos. Yes, he could have said something, but why? His silence was the best rebuke for those who thought everything could be bought with likes and views. Kate bowed her head and stepped back. She would remember this day forever, not as a fun episode for social media, but as a bitter lesson. Respect isn't a commodity or a game. The virtual tribunal. The internet doesn't forgive. As the crowd dispersed, the video was already spreading online at lightning speed. Smartphones uploaded the footage, and comments poured in. Sometimes you just need to be quiet and respect other people's work. That guard showed everyone that dignity isn't a joke. I hope this girl realizes the royal guards aren't props for her blog. Even those who once thought such antics were harmless now viewed them with condemnation. One user wrote, "We need more guards like this to teach respect to all these social media stars." The contrast and the conclusion. A world of contrasts. The crowd drifted away. James remained at his post, blending once more with the grandeur of the palace. And somewhere behind him, Kate and her friend's shadows slowly faded. Their laughter no longer bold, their steps no longer confident. And here's the takeaway. Maybe someone left that crowd thinking that traditions and honor still matter? Let's hope so. Otherwise, well, respect can't be upheld by guards alone. This day reminded everyone. Behind the bearskin hats and stoic faces stand people who dedicate themselves to service. They aren't actors or attractions. They are guardians of a heritage that deserves respect, and James's silence became the loudest message of all.